I stood outside conference room 14 beholding a leather portfolio that contained 15 years of documentation, my hands steady even though my heart hammered against my ribs. Through the glass walls, I could see my father at the head of the table, my mother to his right, and my siblings laughing about something that probably involved how incompetent I was. They'd called this emergency board meeting to officially remove me from my junior analyst position, the same role I'd held for 7 years while Preston and Vanessa climbed to VP titles in 18 months. What they didn't know was that I'd called this meeting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'd forged my father's signature on the agenda, used his executive access that he'd carelessly left logged in on the shared family computer, and invited every single board member including the 3 who'd been trying to vote my father out for 2 years. My brother caught sight of me through the glass and smirked, nudging Vanessa. She glanced over, rolled her eyes, and made a dismissive gesture like she was shooing away a fly. My mother didn't even look up from her phone. But Mr. Caldwell, seated near the far end, met my gaze and gave the smallest nod. That was my signal. I pushed open the door and walked in like I owned the place, because in about 30 minutes, I would. 3 months earlier, I'd been standing in the cramped kitchen of my Capitol Hill studio, reheating leftover pad thai and trying not to think about the fact that it was Thanksgiving. My phone sat face down on the counter because I already knew what I'd find if I checked it. Family photos from the Mercer Island estate. The mahogany dining table stretched long beneath the chandelier my grandmother had imported from France. My parents at either end, Preston and Vanessa in the seats of honor, Aunt Lorraine probably making her famous maple bourbon glaze that she only brought out for special occasions. There would be 18 people there. Cousins, family friends, my father's golfing buddies. Everyone except me. The invitation had never come. Not in the mail, not via text, not even as a courtesy call. 3 years running now, and I'd stopped expecting it. What hurt more than the exclusion was the performance they'd put on the following Monday at the office. My mother breezing past my cubicle with a bright smile, asking if I'd had a nice quiet holiday, emphasis on quiet. Preston forwarding me the family photo with the subject line, "What you missed," and a winky face emoji. Vanessa stopping by to tell me that Aunt Lorraine had asked about me, said something about how it must be hard being the one who didn't quite fit the Harper mold. I'd worked at Harper Industries since I was 22, right out of college with a degree in industrial engineering and a minor in supply chain management. I'd chosen that path specifically because I knew the company was hemorrhaging money in logistics, that our shipping costs were 30% higher than industry standard, and that nobody in leadership seemed to care because profits were still good enough to fund the executive retreats in Cabo. My father had hired me the way you'd hire a neighbor's kid to mow the lawn. A favor, not an investment. My starting title was Junior Data Analyst, a position that didn't require my degree and paid about 40% of what my skill set was worth. I didn't complain. I thought if I worked hard enough, put in the hours, showed them what I could do, they'd see me differently. That was 7 years ago. I was still a junior data analyst. My salary had increased twice, barely matching inflation. Meanwhile, Preston had been made VP of Sales after 2 years in a senior account manager role he'd barely shown up for, and Vanessa had been handed VP of Marketing after throwing a successful product launch party that cost the company $200,000 and resulted in a net loss once you factored in the actual sales generated. The kitchen light in my studio flickered, a problem my landlord kept saying he'd fix but never did. I ate standing up because my table was covered in spreadsheets, printed reports, and a growing pile of documents I'd been collecting for the past 9 months. It started small. A discrepancy I noticed in a quarterly report. Preston's sales numbers didn't match the revenue deposits. I thought maybe it was an accounting error, so I dug deeper. That's when I found the shell vendor accounts. For companies that didn't exist, all billing Harper Industries for consulting services that were never rendered. The payments traced back to an account Preston controlled. $20,000 a month, for 18 months. $360,000, gone. I should have reported it immediately, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of the last time I'd raised a concern, when I'd pointed out that Vanessa's marketing campaign was targeting the wrong demographic and would likely result in wasted ad spend. She'd laughed, said I didn't understand creative strategy, and my father had agreed. The campaign lost them $500,000. Vanessa got a bonus for trying something bold. So instead of reporting Preston, I started documenting. I pulled every invoice, every payment record, every email chain I could access through the shared company drives. Then I started looking at Vanessa's budgets. What I found was worse. She'd been funneling company money into her personal brand, using Harper Industries resources to build her social media presence, paying influencers with corporate funds to promote her lifestyle content that had nothing to do with our products. Another $150,000, easy. But the real discovery came when I started digging into my parents' decisions. The Mercer Island estate had been refinanced twice in 3 years. Both times, the loan documents listed the company as collateral. That wasn't unusual for a family business, but what was unusual was that neither refinance had been approved by the board. My father had used an emergency powers clause that was only meant for acquisitions and time-sensitive deals. He'd taken out $4 million in personal loans against the company without oversight, and the money had vanished into private accounts I couldn't trace. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, that maybe it was reinvestment or some strategy one didn't understand. Then I found the travel expenses. My parents had taken 9 international trips in 2 years, all labeled as business development. Except I cross-referenced the dates with our client acquisition records and partnership announcements. None of the trips resulted in new contracts. They were vacations, billed to Harper Industries, totaling somewhere north of $300,000. I sat on my futon that Thanksgiving night, laptop balanced on my knees, and did the math. Conservative estimates put the misappropriated funds at just under $5 million over 3 years. That was enough to trigger a forensic audit. Enough to warrant criminal investigation if the board chose to pursue it. Enough to destroy my family. I closed the laptop and stared at the blank wall across from me, where most people would hang art or photos. I'd never bothered decorating. This place had always felt temporary, like I was just waiting for my real life to start. For my family to finally see me. For my parents to acknowledge that I was just as capable as my siblings. For an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner. The pad thai had gone cold again. I dumped it in the trash and went to bed. The next morning, I showed up to the office at 6:30, same as always. The building was nearly empty, just the security guard at the front desk and a few workaholics from the engineering department. I liked it this way. Quiet. No risk of running into Preston, who'd make some comment about my shoes or my hair or the fact that I brought my lunch in Tupperware instead of eating out. No chance of passing Vanessa in the hall and having to endure her fake sweet voice asking if I'd done anything fun over the holiday, already knowing I'd spent it alone. I made coffee in the break room, the cheap kind from the bulk container because the good stuff was kept in the executive lounge and my keycard didn't grant access. Then I went to my cubicle, lodged between 2 file cabinets on the 3rd floor, and got to work. My official responsibilities involved generating reports that nobody read. Sales trends, inventory analysis, shipping efficiency metrics. I'd submit them every Monday, and they'd go into a folder that I'm pretty sure my father never opened. But that left me with access to nearly every database in the company. Financial records, HR files, vendor contracts, client communications. I wasn't supposed to look at most of it, but nobody had ever restricted my permissions because nobody thought I was important enough to cause problems. That was their first mistake. Over the next 2 months, I built a case. Not just documentation of fraud, but a comprehensive analysis of how the company was failing under my family's leadership. Revenue was down 18% year over year. Client retention had dropped to 62%, well below industry standard. Employee turnover was at 40%, which meant we were losing institutional knowledge faster than we could replace it. And the profit margins my father kept bragging about in shareholder meetings were artificially inflated by cutting costs in R&D and quality control. We were coasting on reputation, and that reputation was eroding. I compiled it all into a presentation. 60 slides, every claim backed by documentation, every number cross-referenced with source material. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add personal grievances. I let the data speak for itself, and the data screamed that Harper Industries was 18 months from either bankruptcy or hostile takeover. Then I did something that scared me more than anything I'd ever done. I reached out to Mr. Caldwell. Vincent Caldwell had been my father's CFO for 20 years before retiring 5 years ago. He'd left on good terms, or so everyone said, but I'd always suspected there was more to it. He'd tried to warn my father about expanding too fast, about taking on debt without diversification, about promoting family over competence. My father had ignored him, and 6 months later, Mr. Caldwell announced his retirement. I'd always liked him. He was one of the few people at company events who'd actually ask me about my work, who'd listen when I talked about process improvements or cost-saving strategies. He'd told me once, at a Christmas party I'd been obligated to attend, that I had a sharper mind for numbers than anyone else in the building. I'd thought he was just being nice. Now I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something. I sent him an email from my personal account. Simple, direct. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Said I wanted his advice on a professional matter, that I'd found some concerning information and didn't know what to do with it. He responded within an hour. Invited me to his townhouse in Ballard that Saturday. When I arrived, he had tea ready, the kind that came in a proper pot with matching cups, and he listened while I walked him through everything I'd found. He didn't interrupt. Didn't dismiss me. Just nodded occasionally and made notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, maybe. Or recognition. Your father is a brilliant salesman, he said quietly, but he never learned the difference between revenue and profit. And your mother enables him because she built her identity around his success. They've raised your siblings to be the same way. Charisma over competence. Image over substance. I asked him what I should do. If I should report it, or if I should just walk away and let the company collapse under its own weight. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and asked me a question I wasn't expecting. Do you want to save Harper Industries, or do you want to prove them wrong? I didn't have an answer. He smiled, just slightly. Because those are two different goals, Natalie. And you need to be clear about which one you're pursuing before you make your next move. I thought about it the entire drive home. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I knew. I wanted both. I wanted to save the company my grandfather had built, the one my father was running into the ground. And I wanted my family to see, publicly and undeniably, that the daughter they dismissed was the only one capable of doing it. Mr. Caldwell and I met 3 more times over the next month. He introduced me to Patricia Nguyen, a board member who'd been vocal about her concerns regarding the company's direction but lacked the evidence to push for change. Patricia was sharp, mid-50s, with a background in corporate restructuring. She listened to my presentation without emotion, asked pointed questions about my sources and methodology, then told me it was the most thorough analysis she'd seen in her 10 years on the board. She also told me that if I wanted this to go anywhere, I needed more than data. I needed allies inside the company, people who could corroborate what I was saying, who could testify that the dysfunction wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet but a daily reality. That's when I met Dylan Torres. He worked in IT, one of those people you never notice because they're always in the server room or behind a screen. I'd helped him once, months earlier, when he'd been trying to track down a security breach and needed access to some old vendor files. He'd thanked me, said most people in the company treated IT like they were janitors, and that he appreciated anyone who actually respected what they did. I reached out and asked if he'd be willing to pull some access logs for me, completely off the record. He asked why. I told him the truth, that I was building a case against my family and I needed proof of who was accessing what accounts and when. He stared at me for a long moment, then said he'd always wondered why someone with my skills was stuck in a cubicle. 2 days later, he handed me a USB drive with 3 years of access logs, email metadata, and file modification records. The picture that emerged was damning. Preston had been logging into financial systems at odd hours, 2 or 3 in the morning, making transfers that were later deleted from the official records. Vanessa had been using company servers to store personal files, gigabytes of influencer content, brand partnership contracts that had nothing to do with Harper Industries. And my parents had been accessing board communications, reading private emails between members who were raising concerns, then strategically excluding those members from key meetings. It wasn't just financial fraud. It was a systemic abuse of power, a family treating a corporation like their personal piggy bank and silencing anyone who questioned it. I felt sick. Not because I was surprised, but because part of me had still hoped I was wrong. That there was some explanation that would make sense, that would let me believe my family wasn't as bad as the evidence suggested. But hope is a stupid thing to cling to when the data is screaming at you. By mid-February, I had everything I needed. Documentation, witness testimony from employees who'd been retaliated against for raising concerns, analysis showing the company was on the brink of insolvency, and a restructuring plan that could save it if implemented immediately. All I needed was the platform to present it. That's when Mr. Caldwell told me about the clause. Buried in the company bylaws, written back when my grandfather founded Harper Industries, was a provision that allowed any stakeholder to call an emergency board meeting if they could demonstrate imminent threat to the company's solvency. It required signatures from 3 board members and documentation of the threat. Patricia signed immediately. Mr. Caldwell, who still held an emeritus board position, signed second. The third signature came from George Feldman, a board member who'd been trying to get my father to hire an external auditor for 2 years. With those signatures, I had the authority to call a meeting. I just needed to make sure my family would actually show up. That's where the forgery came in, and I'm not proud of it, but I'd stopped caring about playing fair the moment I realized my family never had. I used my father's computer login, the one he'd left saved on the family desktop that still sat in his home office, a room I'd been allowed into exactly twice in my entire childhood. I drafted an email from his account to the full board, marking it high priority, stating that he was calling an emergency meeting to address critical operational issues and that attendance was mandatory. I knew he'd see it eventually, but by the time he did, the meeting would already be on everyone's calendar and canceling it would raise questions he couldn't afford to answer. Then I did something riskier. I sent a separate email to Preston and Vanessa from an anonymous account, telling them that the board was planning to review their performance and that they should prepare to defend their divisions. I knew their egos wouldn't let them miss it. They'd show up ready to posture and deflect, completely unaware that they were walking into an ambush. The morning of the meeting, I woke up at 4. Couldn't sleep anyway. I made coffee, reviewed my notes one last time, and tried to ignore the voice in my head that sounded a lot like my mother, telling me I was being dramatic, that I didn't understand how business really worked, that I should be grateful for the opportunities I'd been given. I put on the suit I'd bought specifically for this, navy blue, tailored, the kind of thing Vanessa would wear to a client pitch. I wanted to look the part. Not the overlooked daughter, not the junior analyst, but someone who belonged in that room making decisions. I drove to the office in silence, no music, just the sound of my heartbeat and the hum of the engine. When I pulled into the parking garage, I sat in the car for 5 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. This was it. No going back. Either I walked in there and dismantled everything my family had built on lies, or I walked away and let them destroy the company and everyone who depended on it. I thought about my grandfather, who I'd barely known before he passed. He'd started Harper Industries in a garage, building custom circuit boards for aerospace companies. He'd built it into something real, something that employed 300 people and contributed to projects that mattered. My father had inherited a legacy and turned it into a vanity project. That's what finally got me out of the car. I walked through the lobby at 7:15, nodding to the security guard who looked mildly surprised to see me dressed like I had somewhere important to be. The elevator ride to the 8th floor felt longer than usual, each floor chime marking another second closer to the moment where everything would either work or fall apart spectacularly. The executive conference wing smelled like expensive coffee and leather furniture, a stark contrast to the 3rd floor where my cubicle sat surrounded by flickering fluorescent lights and the perpetual smell of microwaved lunches. I'd only been up here a handful of times, usually to drop off reports that nobody asked for, sliding them onto an assistant's desk and leaving before anyone important could see me. Conference room 14B was the largest one, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a table that could seat 20 people comfortably. I'd reserved it using my father's admin access, another small forgery that made my stomach turn but not enough to stop me. The room was empty when I arrived. I set my portfolio on the table at the far end, opposite where my father would naturally sit at the head. I'd thought about that detail carefully. If I sat too close, it would look like I was seeking approval. Too far and it would seem like I was afraid. But directly across, that was a challenge. That said, I belonged in this conversation as an equal. The audio-visual system took me 3 tries to get working. I'd practiced this part at home, running through the presentation on my laptop, but the conference room setup was different, more complicated. By the time I got my slides loaded and the screen positioned correctly, it was 7:45. Board members would start arriving in 15 minutes. My hands were shaking slightly, so I gripped the edge of the table and focused on my breathing. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. A technique I'd learned from a therapist I'd seen briefly after a particularly brutal performance review where my father had told me I lacked the Harper instinct for business. The therapist had suggested that maybe the problem wasn't my instinct but my environment. I'd stopped going after that session because hearing the truth out loud made it harder to keep showing up every day. Patricia Nguyen arrived first, precisely at 8. She wore a charcoal suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked older than I was. She nodded at me, took a seat in the middle of the table on the window side, and pulled out a legal pad. No small talk, no pleasantries. She was here to work. Mr. Caldwell came next, moving slower than I remembered but still sharp-eyed. He sat beside Patricia, positioning himself as part of her block rather than near where my father would sit. Strategic placement. 2 more board members filtered in, George Feldman and Susan Ortiz, both of whom I'd briefed individually over the past 2 weeks. They knew what was coming. They'd agreed it needed to happen. But I could see the tension in their shoulders, the way they avoided looking directly at me. This wasn't just a business decision for them. They'd known my father for decades. Some of them had been at my baptism. At 8:05, I heard voices in the hallway. My mother's laugh, high and bright, the sound she made at charity galas when she was performing graciousness. Then my father's baritone, saying something about tea times and how the greens at his club were finally recovering from winter. Preston's voice joined in, some joke I couldn't quite hear but that made my father laugh. Vanessa said something about her Instagram engagement being up 40%, and my mother congratulated her like she'd just won a Nobel Prize. They walked in together, a united front, and stopped short when they saw me standing at the far end of the table. My father's expression cycled through confusion, irritation, and finally dismissal in about 3 seconds. He glanced at Patricia, then at Mr. Caldwell, clearly trying to figure out what was happening but not concerned enough to be worried. My mother's smile stayed frozen in place, but her eyes went cold. Preston looked at me like I was a piece of furniture that had been rearranged without his permission. Vanessa actually laughed, a sharp little sound that echoed off the windows. "What is this?" she said, not to me but to my father. "Why is she here?" My father moved to his usual seat at the head of the table, settling in like nothing was unusual. He pulled out his phone, already half checked out. "I called this meeting," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Under Provision 47 of the company bylaws." The room went very quiet. My father looked up from his phone. Preston stopped mid-step on his way to the coffee station. My mother's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Vanessa's laugh died in her throat. "Provision 47, Mr. Caldwell said calmly, addressing my father, allows any stakeholder to convene an emergency session if they can demonstrate imminent threat to company solvency. It requires 3 board signatures. We have 5. He gestured to himself, Patricia, George, Susan, and then to David Park, who'd slipped in quietly during my family's entrance and taken a seat near the door. My father's face went red, the color creeping up from his collar. He looked at Mr. Caldwell with something like betrayal. "Vincent, this is inappropriate. If there are concerns, they should be addressed through proper channels, not ambushed in front of the full board." "This is the proper channel," Patricia said, her voice crisp. "And it's not an ambush. It's an audit." My mother stood abruptly. "Absolutely not. Richard, tell them this is unacceptable. We don't answer to them. They answer to us." "Actually," Susan Ortiz said quietly, her first words since entering, "the board's fiduciary responsibility is to the shareholders and the company's long-term viability. Not to the Harper family specifically. If there's evidence of mismanagement, we're legally obligated to review it." Preston finally found his voice. "This is insane. Who do you think you are?" He pointed at me, his fingers shaking slightly. "You're a junior analyst. You don't have the authority to call meetings or make accusations. You barely have the clearance to access your own files." I met his eyes and didn't look away. "I have documentation of financial irregularities totaling $4.7 million over 3 years. I have access logs showing unauthorized use of company systems. I have testimony from 12 employees regarding retaliation and hostile work environment complaints that were suppressed. And I have a restructuring proposal that could save this company if implemented in the next 60 days. I paused, let that sink in. "So to answer your question, Preston, I'm the person who's been doing my job while you've been embezzling from vendor accounts." The word embezzling hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Vanessa gasped. My mother grabbed the back of my father's chair. Preston went pale, then flushed red. "That's slander," he sputtered. "You can't just throw around accusations without proof." I clicked the remote in my hand. The screen behind me lit up with the first slide of my presentation. Harper Industries Financial Analysis, prepared by Natalie Harper, February 2025. The next slide showed a summary of findings. Shell vendor accounts, falsified expense reports, unauthorized personal loans against company assets, misappropriated marketing funds. Each line item had a dollar amount attached. Each dollar amount had a citation to source documents. My father stood slowly. His phone clattered onto the table. "Natalie," he said, and his voice had that dangerous quiet quality I remembered from childhood, the tone that came right before groundings or lectures about disappointing the family. "You need to stop this right now. Whatever you think you found, you're misinterpreting the data. Business operations are complex. You don't have the experience to understand the decisions your mother and I make at the executive level." I advanced to the next slide. It showed Preston's sales numbers compared to actual revenue deposits, month by month for 18 months. The gap between reported sales and deposited funds was highlighted in red. The pattern was undeniable. Someone was skimming. I looked at my father. "Then explain this." He stared at the screen. I watched him try to process it, try to find the angle that would make it go away. My mother leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear. Preston had gone completely still, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Vanessa pulled out her phone and started typing furiously, probably texting someone, maybe her lawyer or maybe just a friend to complain about how unfair this was. George Feldman cleared his throat. "I think we should let Natalie present her findings. We can discuss rebuttals afterward." My father looked like he wanted to argue, but Patricia was already nodding, and so was David Park. He was outnumbered and he knew it. He sat back down hard, jaw clenched. I spent the next 40 minutes walking through every piece of evidence. I kept my tone neutral, factual. This wasn't a personal attack, even though it felt like one. This was a financial audit presented by someone who understood the numbers better than anyone else in the room. I showed the shell companies Preston had created, traced the payments back to his personal accounts. I displayed Vanessa's marketing expenditures, highlighted the ones that had nothing to do with company business and everything to do with building her personal brand. I pulled up the travel expenses my parents had charged to the company, cross-referenced them with client meetings that never happened. I showed the loan documents my father had signed without board approval, using company assets as collateral for personal debt. Every few slides, my father would try to interrupt. That was a legitimate business expense. Those vendors were vetted by our procurement team. The loans were strategic investments. But Patricia would cut him off, ask me to continue. Mr. Caldwell sat with his arms folded, expression unreadable. The other board members took notes. Preston stared at his hands. Vanessa had stopped texting and was now crying quietly, mascara starting to streak. My mother's face had gone hard as stone. When I reached the final section, the one about company performance, the room was silent except for my voice. Revenue down 18% year-over-year. Client retention at 62% when industry standard is 85%. Employee turnover at 40%, costing approximately $2.1 million annually in recruitment and training. Profit margins artificially maintained by cutting research and development, which has resulted in our product line falling 2 generations behind competitors. I clicked to the last slide. Projected insolvency timeline, 18 to 24 months unless immediate corrective action is taken. I turned off the screen and set down the remote. My hands were steady now. The hard part was over. I'd laid out the case, shown them everything they needed to see. Now it was just a matter of watching them decide what to do with it. My father stood again, slower this time. When he spoke, his voice was different. Softer. Almost pleading. Natalie, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here. You've embarrassed your family in front of the board. You've made accusations that could destroy relationships we've built over decades. If you had concerns, you should have come to me privately. We could have discussed this like adults. I felt something crack inside my chest, the last fragile hope that maybe, even now, he might actually hear me. I came to you, I said quietly. 3 years ago. I told you we were overspending on vendor contracts and I'd found a way to reduce logistics costs by 22%. You told me I didn't understand the complexity of supplier relationships. 2 years ago I showed you data proving Vanessa's marketing campaigns were targeting the wrong demographics. You said I didn't have creative vision. Last year I warned you that our client retention was dropping and we needed to invest in customer service infrastructure. You told me I was being dramatic. I paused, felt tears prickling but refused to let them fall. So no, I didn't come to you privately this time. Because you've never listened to me privately. You've only ever heard what you wanted to hear. My mother spoke up, her voice sharp. This is about your feelings being hurt? You're willing to destroy this family's legacy because you felt overlooked? Grow up, Natalie. Not everyone gets to be special. Some people are meant to support from the background. I looked at her, this woman who'd given birth to me but never really seen me. I'm not destroying the legacy, I said. I'm saving it. And I turned to the board. Based on the evidence presented, I'm formally requesting a vote of no confidence in Richard Harper as CEO and Catherine Harper as COO, effective immediately. I'm also requesting criminal referral to the State Attorney General's Office for investigation into fraudulent financial practices by Preston Harper and Vanessa Harper. The room erupted. My father shouted something about betrayal. Vanessa was sobbing openly now. Preston slammed his hand on the table. You can't do this. You're nobody. My mother moved toward me like she might physically drag me from the room, but Mr. Caldwell stepped between us smoothly. Catherine, I suggest you sit down. This is a formal board proceeding. Any interference could be considered obstruction. She stopped, trembling with rage. My father pointed at Patricia. You're going to let her do this? After everything our family has done for this company? Patricia met his gaze steadily. The company exists independent of your family, Richard. That's what incorporation means. And right now, the evidence suggests the company is better off without your leadership. George Feldman spoke next. I've reviewed the documentation Natalie provided. It's thorough and well-sourced. I see no reason to doubt its accuracy. Susan Ortiz nodded. I agree. This warrants immediate action. David Park, who'd been silent the entire meeting, finally spoke. I've been on this board for 6 years. I've raised concerns about financial oversight at least a dozen times and been told to trust the family's judgment. I'm done trusting. I vote in favor of both motions. One by one, the board members stated their positions. Patricia, yes. Mr. Caldwell, yes. George, yes. Susan, yes. David, yes. 5 votes. That was enough. The motions passed. My father looked like he'd been struck. My mother's face crumpled, all her composure dissolving. Preston was still shouting, threatening lawsuits, but his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. Vanessa had her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. I stood there, portfolio still in front of me, and felt nothing. Not triumph, not vindication, not even satisfaction. Just exhaustion. Patricia stood and addressed the room. Effective immediately, Richard Harper and Catherine Harper are removed from executive leadership. Preston Harper and Vanessa Harper are suspended pending criminal investigation. The board will appoint an interim CEO and COO to manage operations while we conduct a full forensic audit and develop a long-term succession plan. She turned to me. Natalie, given your knowledge of the company's financial situation and your clear competence in operational analysis, we'd like to offer you the interim CFO position. Are you willing to accept? The room went completely silent. My father's face was purple. My mother looked like she might faint. Preston and Vanessa stared at me with identical expressions of disbelief and hatred. I thought about saying no. About walking away and letting them figure it out themselves. About finding a job somewhere else where I wouldn't carry the weight of this family's dysfunction. But then I thought about my grandfather, about the company he'd built with his hands and his mind. About the 300 employees who had families and mortgages and lives that depended on Harper Industries surviving. About the person I'd been 3 months ago, standing in her studio apartment eating cold takeout and wondering if she'd ever matter to anyone. I looked at Patricia. Yes, I said. I accept. The board meeting adjourned at 10:30. My parents left first, my father refusing to look at anyone, my mother's heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. Preston and Vanessa followed, Preston still muttering threats about legal action while Vanessa clung to his arm like she might collapse without support. I watched them go through the glass walls, 4 people who'd spent their entire lives believing the world would bend to accommodate them, now facing the reality that it wouldn't. The remaining board members stayed behind to discuss logistics. Patricia pulled out a tablet and started drafting press releases. George made calls to the company's external auditors. Mr. Caldwell sat beside me and placed a hand on my shoulder. You did the right thing, he said quietly. That doesn't always mean it feels good. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. By noon, the news had spread through the building like wildfire. I could feel it as I walked back to my cubicle, the way conversations stopped when I passed, the way eyes followed me down the hallway. Someone had leaked details of the meeting already, probably one of the executives who'd been lingering outside the conference room trying to eavesdrop. The story would be all over industry message boards by end of day, twisted and distorted through a dozen retellings until nobody knew what was true anymore. I sat down at my desk, the same cramped space I'd occupied for 7 years, surrounded by file cabinets and the low hum of outdated computers. It felt surreal. 2 hours ago I'd been presenting evidence that would dismantle my family's control of the company. Now I was supposed to just go back to generating reports nobody read. My phone buzzed. A text from Grace Kim, my assistant, though calling her that felt wrong since I'd never had the authority to actually assign her work. She just started helping me voluntarily about a year ago, said she appreciated that I treated her like a person instead of a coffee machine. The text read, "Everyone's talking about what happened. Are you okay?" I typed back, "Define okay." She responded immediately, "Fair. Want me to bring you lunch? You probably shouldn't go to the cafeteria right now." I appreciated that she understood without me having to explain. "Yes please," I wrote. Anything but pad thai. The afternoon crawled by. I tried to focus on work but kept getting pulled into emergency meetings. Patricia wanted to discuss the transition timeline. The external auditors needed access to financial systems. HR required documentation of the complaints I'd mentioned against Preston and Vanessa. By 4 o'clock my head was pounding and I'd consumed 3 cups of terrible break room coffee. Dylan from IT appeared at my cubicle entrance, holding a cardboard box. "I brought you something," he said, setting it on my desk. I looked inside. A brand new laptop, still in packaging, top-of-the-line specs. "You're going to need better equipment if you're CFO now," he explained. "This is from the executive hardware allocation. I figured nobody would notice if one went missing during all the chaos. Plus your current setup is from like 2012. I actually laughed, the first genuine sound I'd made all day. "Thank you," I said. He shrugged. "You helped me when nobody else would. I don't forget stuff like that." At 5 I finally left the building, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The parking garage was nearly empty, most people having fled early to avoid whatever drama was still unfolding. I sat in my car with the engine running, heat blasting against the March cold, and checked my phone. 17 missed calls from my mother. 12 texts from Vanessa, starting with confusion and escalating to rage. Nothing from my father or Preston. I blocked all their numbers without reading the full messages. Whatever they wanted to say, I didn't need to hear it. What I needed was to figure out how to actually be a CFO, a role I'd never trained for and definitely hadn't expected to hold at 29. I drove to Mr. Caldwell's townhouse in Ballard without calling ahead. He answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, a book in his hand. I saw the title, something about naval warfare history. He smiled when he saw me. "I wondered when you'd show up." "Come in. I'm making decaf." His home smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. The kind of smell that suggested someone lived here who actually cared about maintenance and routines. He poured 2 cups of coffee in the kitchen while I sat at his small dining table, the same one where we'd first planned this entire operation. "So," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "How does it feel to win?" I wrapped my hands around the warm mug. "It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like I just blew up my entire family." He nodded slowly. "You did. But they were already standing on a foundation of lies. You just lit the match. The question is what you're going to build in the aftermath." I told him I didn't know if I could actually do the job, that I'd spent 7 years analyzing data but never making strategic decisions, never managing teams or negotiating with vendors or presenting to shareholders. He listened patiently, then pulled out a folder from the cabinet behind him. Inside were organizational charts, contact lists, operational procedures. "Everything you need to know is documented," he said. "Your grandfather believed in systems over personalities. That's why the company survived this long despite your father's leadership. The infrastructure is solid. You just need to learn how to use it." We spent the next 3 hours going through the basics. How board meetings actually functioned. Who the key stakeholders were and what motivated them. Which department heads could be trusted and which ones were my father's cronies who'd need to be replaced. Mr. Caldwell had kept detailed notes during his tenure as CFO, observations about company culture and power dynamics that he'd never felt comfortable sharing while my father was in charge. Now he laid it all out, giving me a crash course in corporate politics and financial strategy. By the time I left it was after 8 and my head was swimming with information, but I felt slightly less terrified than I had that morning. The next day I arrived at the office at 6, earlier than usual because I knew I'd need time to prepare before facing people. Grace was already there, sitting outside what had been my father's office on the 9th floor. She stood when she saw me. "Patricia asked me to help you transition," she explained. "I hope that's okay. Your new office is ready." She gestured to the door behind her. I stared at it. The nameplate still read Richard Harper, CEO. Someone had taped a piece of paper over it with my name printed in neat capitals. Natalie Harper, interim CFO. It looked temporary because it was. Everything about this situation was temporary. The board had made that clear. I was a placeholder while they figured out long-term leadership. But standing there looking at my name on that door, even on a piece of printer paper, something shifted in my chest. The office was bigger than my entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. A desk that could double as a small dining table. Bookshelves lined with business theory texts my father had probably never read. Grace had already cleared out the personal items, family photos, and golf trophies and the mounted fish my father claimed he'd caught but had actually paid a charter captain to land for him. The space felt hollow, waiting to be filled with whoever I was going to become in this role. I set my bag down on the desk and tried to imagine myself belonging here. It didn't take. The morning was a blur of meetings I barely understood. Department heads coming in to introduce themselves or reintroduce themselves since I'd been largely invisible for the past 7 years. Some were clearly skeptical, arms crossed and answers clipped. Others seemed cautiously hopeful, like maybe new leadership meant things might actually change. I took notes on everything, names and roles and the subtle dynamics of who deferred to whom. Patricia sat in on most of the meetings, providing context when I looked lost. By lunch I was mentally exhausted but there was no time to stop. The forensic auditors had questions about Preston's accounts. HR needed sign-off on the suspension paperwork. Legal wanted to discuss potential criminal charges and what that meant for the company's liability. Around 2, Dylan appeared at my door with another box. "You're going to need this too," he said, pulling out what looked like an external hard drive. "It's a backup of every email, file transfer, and system access from the past 5 years. Completely encrypted. If anyone tries to delete evidence or claim they didn't know about certain transactions, you'll have proof." I stared at him. "How long have you been collecting this?" He grinned. "Let's just say your family wasn't the only one who thought they were untouchable. IT sees everything. We just don't usually have a reason to do anything about it." He set the drive on my desk. "Now you do." That evening I stayed late, long after most employees had left. I pulled up the financial projections I'd been running for months, the ones that showed we had maybe 2 years before insolvency if nothing changed. Then I started building a new model. What if we cut the executive retreats, redirected that money into R&D? What if we renegotiated vendor contracts using the leverage I'd identified in my supply chain analysis? What if we invested in employee retention programs, reduced turnover, stopped hemorrhaging institutional knowledge? The numbers started to shift. Not dramatically, not overnight miracle turnaround, but enough. Enough to suggest that with disciplined leadership and strategic investment, Harper Industries could stabilize within 18 months and return to growth within 3 years. I was so focused on the spreadsheet I didn't hear footsteps until someone cleared their throat. I looked up to find a woman in her 50s standing in my doorway, short silver hair and an expression that suggested she didn't tolerate nonsense. "You're Natalie Harper," she said. Not a question. "I'm Sharon Liu, VP of Operations. We met briefly this morning but you had about 30 people to keep track of so I doubt you remember." I did remember, actually. She'd been one of the few people who'd looked me in the eye during introductions, who'd asked substantive questions about my plans rather than just sizing me up. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit." She did, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. "I'm going to be direct because that's how I operate and I think you'll appreciate it. Half the leadership team is terrified you're going to fire them. The other half is planning to undermine you at every opportunity because they're loyal to your father and don't think you deserve to be here." I nodded slowly. "Which half are you?" She smiled, sharp and quick. "Neither. I think you're smart and I think you give a damn, which is more than I can say for the previous administration. But you're also inexperienced and you're going to make mistakes. The question is whether you're willing to listen when people tell you you're wrong." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me all day. "I can listen," I told her. "What I can't do is pretend the problems don't exist just to keep people comfortable." She leaned forward. "Then here's what you need to know. Operations is a disaster. We're running on outdated processes because your father refused to invest in modernization. Our fulfillment time is twice what it should be. We're losing clients to competitors who can deliver faster and cheaper. I've been trying to get approval for a systems overhaul for 3 years, but every budget request gets denied because the money goes to executive compensation and marketing vanity projects. She paused. If you're serious about saving this company, operations is where you start. Fix our delivery pipeline and client retention will follow. I pulled up a new document and started taking notes. Tell me what you need. She blinked, clearly not expecting immediate action. Then she started talking. For the next hour she outlined a complete operational restructuring plan. New software systems, process automation, supply chain optimization. She had numbers, timelines, vendor recommendations. This was work she'd clearly been doing in her spare time, preparing for a leadership team that might actually care. When she finished, I looked at the projected costs. It was substantial but not impossible, especially if we cut the expenses I'd already identified as wasteful. I can get you 70% of this budget by next quarter, I said. The rest will phase in over 18 months as cash flow improves. She stared at me. Seriously? I met her gaze. You're right that I'm inexperienced. Which means I need people who know what they're doing and aren't afraid to tell me the truth. If you're willing to work with me, I'm willing to give you the resources to fix this. She stood, extended her hand. I think we're going to get along just fine. After she left, I sat back in the enormous desk chair and exhaled slowly. This was how it was going to work. One conversation at a time, one department at a time, building trust with people who had no reason to trust a Harper after what my family had done. Over the next 2 weeks I met with every department head individually. Some meetings went like the one with Sharon, productive and collaborative. Others were hostile, people who'd built their careers on proximity to my father and saw me as a threat. I documented everything, who was willing to work constructively and who spent the meeting defending the old way of doing things. Patricia advised me to move slowly on personnel changes, not to create more chaos while the company was already unstable. But I made a list. When the time was right, about a third of leadership would need to be replaced. The forensic audit results came back in mid-March. The official number was higher than my estimate. $5.2 million in misappropriated funds over 3 years, with evidence suggesting it had been going on even longer. The auditors recommended criminal referral for Preston and Vanessa, civil action to recover funds, and immediate termination of their employment. My parents weren't directly implicated in the fraud, but the reports cited gross negligence in oversight and abuse of executive authority. The board voted unanimously to pursue all recommended actions. I abstained from the vote to avoid any appearance of personal vendetta, even though that's exactly what it felt like. My mother tried calling from a blocked number. I didn't recognize it at first and answered. Her voice came through, tight and controlled. You've destroyed this family, she said without preamble. Your father hasn't left the house in days. Your sister is having panic attacks. Preston's lawyer says the charges could mean prison time. I hope you're satisfied. I sat in my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, and tried to find words that would make her understand. I didn't destroy the family, I finally said. I exposed what was already there. There's a difference. She laughed, bitter and sharp. You always thought you were smarter than everyone else. Too clever for your own good. That's why nobody liked you, Natalie. Not because you were overlooked but because you were insufferable. And now you've proven it. You'd rather tear down everything we built than admit you were never good enough to be part of it. The words should have hurt. A year ago they would have shattered me. But sitting there in my small apartment with my laptop open to operational reports and restructuring plans, I felt nothing except tired. I'm sorry you see it that way, I said quietly. But I'm not sorry for what I did. Then she hung up. I set the phone down and went back to work. There were vendor contracts to review, budget proposals to analyze, 3 departments waiting on decisions that would affect hundreds of jobs. I didn't have time to process my mother's hatred. That could wait. By early April the company had stabilized enough that the panic had faded into cautious optimism. We'd announced the operational restructuring plan. Sharon's team had already implemented the first phase of process improvements and fulfillment times were dropping. I'd renegotiated contracts with our 3 largest vendors, cutting costs by 18% without reducing quality. Client retention had ticked up 3 points, not dramatic but trending in the right direction. The board scheduled a shareholders meeting for late April to address the leadership changes and outline the path forward. Patricia coached me on the presentation. "Keep it factual," she said. "Don't get emotional. These people want to know their investment is safe, not whether your feelings got hurt." The night before the meeting I couldn't sleep. I kept running through the presentation, anticipating questions, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. Around 2 a.m. I gave up and went to the office. The building was empty, just security and the night cleaning crew. I rode the elevator to the 9th floor and walked into my office, still not quite feeling like it belonged to me. The city lights reflected off the water, Seattle sprawled out below like a circuit board. I thought about my grandfather, somewhere in my memory, talking about the early days of the company. How he'd worked 18-hour days building prototypes in his garage. How he'd nearly gone bankrupt twice before landing the contract that saved everything. How he'd always said the secret to business was simple: solve real problems for real people and don't lie about what you can deliver. I pulled out the old photo I'd found in the company archives, my grandfather standing in front of the original Harper Industries facility. It was just a small industrial space in an unremarkable building, but he looked proud. Behind him you could see employees, maybe a dozen people, all looking at the camera with the kind of tired satisfaction that comes from honest work. I'd had the photo framed and put it on the credenza behind my desk. A reminder of what the company was supposed to be before it became my family's personal empire. "I'm trying," I whispered to the photo. "I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I'm trying." The shareholders' meeting started at 9. The room was packed, easily 150 people, plus media in the back since news of the Harper family implosion had made regional business headlines. I stood at the podium in a navy suit Sharon had helped me pick out, looking professional but not trying too hard. Patricia gave the opening remarks, explaining the board's actions and the rationale behind the leadership changes. Then she introduced me. Natalie Harper has served Harper Industries for 7 years in financial analysis. She identified the systemic issues that prompted this transition and has demonstrated both the competence and integrity required to lead during this critical period. Please welcome our interim CFO. The applause was polite but muted. I could see the skepticism on faces throughout the room. I was young, I was untested, and I carried the same last name as the people who'd nearly destroyed the company. I clicked to the first slide and began. 3 months ago, Harper Industries was 18 months from insolvency. Today I'm here to show you how we're going to survive and why you should keep your investment. For the next 45 minutes I walked through everything. The problems we'd identified, the corrections we'd implemented, the projected timeline for return to profitability. I showed them Sharon's operational improvements, the vendor renegotiations, the employee retention programs we'd launched. I was honest about the challenges still ahead, the market share we'd lost and would need to fight to regain. But I also showed them the foundation was solid, that the company my grandfather built was still worth saving. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then someone in the 3rd row started clapping. Others joined. Not everyone, but enough. A shareholder in the front raised his hand. I called on him. "You mention employee retention," he said. "What's your plan for leadership retention? Half your executive team was related to the previous CEO. How do we know you're not just going to install your own cronies?" "Fair question," I replied. "I've made exactly 3 executive appointments in the past 2 months, all internal promotions based on performance and departmental need. I'm not hiring friends or family. I'm hiring people who can do the job." If that's not enough assurance, the board has implemented quarterly performance reviews for all leadership positions including mine. If I'm not delivering results, I'll be replaced just like anyone else. Another hand went up. A woman in her 60s, stern expression. "What about the criminal charges against your siblings? Does their legal situation create liability for the company?" I'd prepared for this one with help from legal. The individuals in question have been terminated and are no longer affiliated with Harper Industries. The company is cooperating fully with law enforcement and has implemented enhanced financial controls to prevent similar issues in the future. Any civil recovery of misappropriated funds will be returned to company assets. We've also purchased additional directors' and officers' insurance to protect against residual liability. She nodded, seemed satisfied. The questions continued for another 30 minutes. Some hostile, some genuinely curious, all of them testing whether I actually knew what I was doing or if this was just a performance. I answered everything as directly as I could, admitting when I didn't know something but explaining how I'd find out. By the time Patricia called the meeting to a close, I was exhausted but still standing. The shareholders voted to approve the board's actions and the restructuring plan. Not unanimous, but a solid majority. It was enough. The weeks after the shareholders' meeting blurred together into a rhythm of early mornings and late nights. I'd arrive at the office before sunrise and leave long after the cleaning crew had finished their rounds. My apartment became just a place to sleep for a few hours before starting again. Grace started keeping protein bars in her desk because I'd forget to eat lunch. Dylan set up a second monitor in my office without being asked, said I'd need the screen real estate for all the financial modeling I was doing. Sharon stopped by every Friday afternoon with operational updates, but really I think she just wanted to make sure I was still functional. The work itself was relentless but clarifying. Every decision I made had immediate visible consequences. When I approved Sharon's equipment upgrades, fulfillment times dropped by 12% within 3 weeks. When I restructured the sales commission model to reward client retention over new acquisition, our customer satisfaction scores started climbing for the first time in 18 months. When I cut the executive dining program and redirected that budget to employee training, productivity increased and turnover dropped 4 percentage points. It wasn't magic. It was just basic management, paying attention to what actually mattered instead of what looked impressive on paper. But not everything went smoothly. In late April, 3 senior managers quit within a week of each other. All of them had been my father's hires. All of them made it clear in their resignation letters that they didn't believe in the new direction and didn't think I had the experience to lead the company. Their departures created gaps in knowledge that took weeks to fill. I promoted from within where I could, brought in 1 external hire for a specialized role Sharon recommended, and absorbed some responsibilities myself until we could properly staff the positions. The board started getting nervous. Patricia pulled me aside after a meeting to say that high turnover in leadership looked bad to investors, that I needed to stabilize the team before confidence eroded further. I understood her concern, but I also knew that keeping people who actively undermined the restructuring would be worse than short-term instability. So I made a choice that probably shortened my tenure as interim CFO but felt necessary anyway. I called an all-hands meeting, something the company hadn't done in years. Every employee, from warehouse staff to executives, crowded into the largest conference space we had. Some people stood along the walls. Others sat on the floor. I stood at the front without a podium, just me and a microphone, and told them the truth. Harper Industries is in trouble, I said. Not might be in trouble, not could be in trouble. Is in trouble. We've lost clients, we've lost market share, and we've lost the trust of people who used to believe in what we built. Some of that is because of decisions my family made. Some of it is because of systemic problems that have been ignored for years. I can't fix all of it overnight and I can't do it alone. What I can do is promise you transparency. I'm going to tell you what's working and what isn't. I'm going to listen when you tell me something is broken. And I'm going to make decisions based on what's best for this company and the people who depend on it, not what's best for my career or my reputation. The room was completely silent. I could see skepticism on some faces, hope on others, exhaustion on most. I continued. If you don't believe in this direction, if you think the old way was better, I respect that and I won't hold it against you if you choose to leave. But if you're willing to stay and help rebuild what we've lost, I need you to actually help. That means telling me when I'm wrong. It means bringing me solutions instead of just complaints. It means working like we're all on the same team instead of protecting departmental territory. I paused, looked around the room. My grandfather built this company because he solved real problems for real people. That's still what we should be doing. So let's do it. The response was mixed. Some people nodded. Others looked unmoved. But in the days that followed, something shifted. Employees started coming to me directly with ideas and concerns they'd apparently been sitting on for months or years. An engineer from the product development team showed me designs for a new component that could reduce manufacturing costs by 15% but had been repeatedly rejected by Preston because it wasn't flashy enough for marketing. A customer service rep brought me data showing that 80% of client complaints stemmed from 3 specific issues that could be resolved with better internal communication protocols. A warehouse supervisor explained how the current inventory system created inefficiencies that added 2 days to every shipment, and he had a proposal for restructuring the workflow that would cut that time in half. I implemented everything I could, fast-tracked the projects that would have immediate impact, and put together task forces for the more complex initiatives. For the first time in Harper Industries' recent history, good ideas weren't dying in committee meetings or getting vetoed because they came from the wrong person. People noticed. The culture started to shift. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in small measurable ways. Employee engagement surveys showed upticks in morale and investment in company success. Exit interviews revealed that people were leaving competitors to come work for us, attracted by word of mouth that Harper Industries was finally being run by someone who cared about substance over performance. In mid-May I got a call from a reporter at the Seattle Business Journal asking for an interview about the turnaround. I almost said no. Media attention felt like inviting scrutiny I couldn't afford while everything was still fragile. But Patricia convinced me it would be good for investor confidence to show that we were stable and moving forward. So I agreed to a 30-minute conversation that turned into 2 hours of discussion about leadership philosophy, family business dynamics, and what it meant to rebuild trust after systemic failure. The article came out a week later under the headline, Harper Industries' Unlikely Savior, How Natalie Harper Became the Boss Nobody Expected. It was mostly positive, framing me as the competent underdog who'd rescued the company from her family's mismanagement. But it also included quotes from unnamed sources, clearly former executives still loyal to my father, suggesting I was vindictive and power-hungry, that I'd orchestrated the whole scandal to seize control. Reading those sections made my chest tight with anger I couldn't quite process. I'd spent 7 years being invisible, and now that I was finally visible, I was being painted as a villain by people who'd enabled actual fraud. Grace found me staring at my computer screen, jaw clenched. She read over my shoulder and made a dismissive sound. "Anyone who knows you knows that's garbage," she said. "And anyone who doesn't know you will figure it out when we post record profits next quarter." I appreciated the confidence even though we both knew record profits were unlikely. Stabilized losses would be an achievement. But she was right that the only real response was to keep doing the work and let results speak louder than speculation. That evening I met Mr. Caldwell for dinner at a quiet restaurant in Fremont. He'd suggested it, said we should celebrate the fact that Harper Industries had made it 3 months without collapsing. Over pasta and red wine he asked how I was holding up. "Honestly," I said, "I don't know. Every day feels like I'm one decision away from proving everyone right who said I wasn't qualified for this." He set down his fork and looked at me with the same measured patience he'd shown during our planning sessions. "Natalie," he said, "do you know why your father failed as a CEO?" I shook my head. He continued. "Because he believed leadership was about being right. He thought if he projected confidence and made bold decisions, people would follow. But leadership isn't about being right. It's about being willing to be wrong and learning from it faster than your competitors." I let that sink in while I pushed linguine around my plate. "You're going to make mistakes," Mr. Caldwell said. "Probably already have. But you're also going to catch them and correct them because you actually care about outcomes more than appearances. That's the difference between you and your family. They needed to look successful. You need to actually be successful. And that's why you'll make it." I wanted to believe him. Some days I did. Other days I lay awake at 3 a.m. convinced I was a fraud, that the board would realize their mistake and replace me with someone who actually knew what they were doing. But I showed up anyway, every morning, because the alternative was letting my grandfather's legacy die and letting 300 employees lose their jobs because my family had treated a company like a personal checking account. June brought new challenges. One of our largest clients, an aerospace contractor who'd been with us since my grandfather's time, announced they were opening bidding for their components supply contract. We'd held that contract for 20 years, but they'd grown frustrated with our delivery delays and quality control issues under my father's leadership. Losing them would mean a 12% revenue hit, enough to undermine all the progress we'd made. Sharon and I spent a week preparing a proposal that addressed every concern they'd raised over the past 2 years. We included the operational improvements we'd implemented, the new quality assurance protocols, the reduced fulfillment times. We also offered a pricing structure that was aggressive but sustainable, cutting into our margins but not eliminating them. The presentation was scheduled for mid-June. I'd be going in with Sharon and our head of engineering, presenting to their procurement committee and executive leadership. The night before I couldn't sleep, kept rehearsing responses to potential objections, running through financial models to make sure our numbers were solid. At 4 a.m. I gave up and went for a walk around my neighborhood. The streets were empty except for early morning joggers and someone walking their dog. The air smelled like coffee from a bakery that opened absurdly early. I bought a cup and sat on a bench watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to pale gray. This was it, I thought. The moment that would determine whether I was actually capable of doing this job or just temporarily holding it together through adrenaline and luck. If we lost this contract, the board would have legitimate reason to question my leadership. If we kept it, we'd have proof that the restructuring was working, that clients believed in the new Harper Industries. I finished the coffee, tossed the cup in a recycling bin, and walked back to my apartment to shower and put on my best suit. Either this would work or it wouldn't, but I'd give it everything I had. The presentation went better than I'd hoped. Sharon was flawless explaining the operational improvements. Our engineering lead demonstrated the new quality control process with technical precision. I handled the financial discussion, showing them how our pricing was competitive and sustainable, how we'd stabilized our cost structure and could guarantee consistent delivery. The procurement committee asked hard questions. What happens if your operational lead leaves? How do we know these improvements are permanent and not just temporary to win back the contract? What assurance do we have that Harper Industries won't slide back into the dysfunction that caused problems in the first place? I answered everything directly. Sharon has a 2-year contract and we've implemented succession planning for all critical roles, so we're not dependent on any single person. Maybe once things stabilized further I'd find better balance. Or maybe I wouldn't. Either way, it was my choice now. Nobody was judging me for not living up to Harper family standards because I'd stopped trying to meet standards that were never really about excellence anyway. I ordered takeout, actually good pad thai this time from a place Dylan had recommended, and ate it while sitting on my futon scrolling through emails. Nothing urgent, just updates and routine communications. I allowed myself to relax for the first time in months, to sit in my small apartment that suddenly felt less like a temporary holding pattern and more like home. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice I didn't recognize asked if this was Natalie Harper. I confirmed. She introduced herself as a recruiter from a major tech company in Silicon Valley, said they were impressed by what I'd accomplished at Harper Industries and wanted to discuss executive opportunities that might interest me. I listened politely while she outlined a role that would pay twice what I was making, come with significant equity, position me in a faster-growing industry. It was objectively a better career move. But as she talked I kept thinking about Sharon and her operational improvements, about Dylan and his quiet competence, about Grace and her loyalty, about the 300 employees who'd stuck with Harper Industries through chaos because they believed in what we were building. I'd spent 7 years being invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Now I was finally visible, and it turned out visibility came with options I'd never had before. The recruiter finished her pitch and asked if I'd be interested in a preliminary conversation. I thanked her for thinking of me and told her I was committed to my current role for the foreseeable future. She said to keep her card in case I changed my mind. I hung up and deleted the number. The official announcement came in mid-July. The board voted unanimously to remove the interim designation from my title. I was now Chief Financial Officer of Harper Industries, permanent appointment, with a compensation package that reflected the responsibility and a 3-year contract that gave me security to make long-term decisions without constantly looking over my shoulder. Patricia called me into her office to deliver the news personally. She handed me the signed contract and said, "You've earned this 10 times over. Now don't let it go to your head." I promised I wouldn't. The press release went out that afternoon. Within hours my email was flooded with congratulations from industry contacts, former professors, people I hadn't spoken to in years who suddenly wanted to reconnect. Some of it felt genuine. Much of it felt opportunistic. I responded to the people who'd actually supported me when I was nobody and ignored the rest. What surprised me most was the message from Aunt Lorraine. She'd never reached out after the board meeting, had apparently sided firmly with my parents during the fallout. Her email was brief and cold. "Congratulations on your appointment. I hope you understand what you've destroyed to get there." I stared at it for a long moment, then moved it to trash without responding. There was nothing to say to someone who thought exposing fraud was worse than committing it. That weekend I did something I hadn't done in months. I took a full day off. No laptop, no work phone, no checking email every 15 minutes. I drove out to the coast, found a quiet stretch of beach near Port Townsend, and spent hours walking along the water. The sand was cold and packed hard from recent rain. Seabirds wheeled overhead. The horizon stretched endless and gray. I thought about my grandfather, wondered if he'd ever imagined his company would nearly collapse under his son's leadership or that his granddaughter would be the one to pull it back from the edge. I thought about the version of myself from a year ago, standing in a cramped apartment convinced she'd never matter to anyone. I thought about all the small decisions that had led here, the choice to document instead of ignore, to act instead of accept, to believe I deserved a seat at the table even when everyone else said I didn't. By the time I drove back to Seattle the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally set down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. Monday morning I arrived at the office and found a package on my desk. Inside was a framed photo, old and slightly faded. My grandfather standing in front of the original Harper Industries building, the same photo I'd found in the archives. But this copy had a handwritten note on the back in his script. July 1987, first profitable quarter. Proof that honest work pays off eventually. I didn't know who'd sent it. Grace claimed she had no idea. Dylan shrugged when I asked. Mr. Caldwell smiled when I showed him but wouldn't confirm or deny involvement. I hung it on the wall opposite my desk where I'd see it every morning. August brought the kind of stability I'd been working toward but hadn't quite believed was possible. Operations were running smoothly under Sharon's leadership. The sales team had rebuilt relationships with 3 clients we'd lost and signed 2 new contracts. Product development launched an updated component line that immediately generated interest from manufacturers who'd previously written us off as outdated. Employee turnover had dropped to 14%, well below industry average. The quarterly earnings report showed our first profit in 8 quarters, modest but real. Wall Street analysts who covered our industry started mentioning Harper Industries as a turnaround success story instead of a cautionary tale. But success brought its own complications. The higher our profile rose, the more attention we attracted from competitors looking to poach our talent and from investors wondering if we were ripe for acquisition. I spent an increasing amount of time fending off offers to buy the company, explaining to private equity firms that we weren't interested in selling. Some of the offers were substantial enough that the board had to take them seriously. Patricia organized a special session to discuss whether we should entertain acquisition proposals. The debate went on for 3 hours. Some board members argued that selling at peak valuation would be smart business, that we'd proven the company was viable and now was the time to capitalize. Others felt we hadn't finished the work, that selling would just hand our success to someone else. I didn't want to bias the discussion, so I stayed quiet for most of the meeting. Finally, Patricia asked me directly what I thought. I chose my words carefully. 9 months ago, this company was on the verge of collapse. We've stabilized it, but we haven't rebuilt everything that was lost. We have momentum but not yet dominance in our market. If we sell now, we're selling potential. If we wait 2 years and continue executing well, We could sell for significantly more, or we could build something valuable enough that we don't need to sell at all. The board could make whatever decision served shareholders best. But from where I sat, we'd be selling too early. The board voted to table acquisition discussions for at least 18 months. We'd revisit if circumstances changed, but for now the focus remained on internal growth. I felt relieved. I'd put too much of myself into rebuilding Harper Industries to watch it get absorbed by a larger company and dismantled for parts. That might have been the financially optimal choice, but it wasn't the one I could live with. After the meeting, Mr. Caldwell pulled me aside. "You handled that well," he said. "Leadership isn't just about making good decisions. It's about knowing when to push and when to let the process work itself out." I was still learning that balance, probably would be for years. September marked a full year since I'd started documenting my family's fraud. The anniversary felt significant, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because a year ago I'd been terrified and alone, convinced that exposing the truth would destroy me along with them. Instead, it had freed me to become someone I hadn't known I could be. I wasn't the same person who'd stood outside conference room 14B with shaking hands and a leather portfolio. That version of me had been so focused on being seen, on proving I deserved recognition. The current version understood that recognition was a byproduct of work that mattered, not a goal in itself. That month we held our first annual employee recognition event since I'd taken over. Previous years it had been a stiff formal dinner where my father gave speeches about excellence and my mother handed out generic plaques. I wanted something different. We rented a venue on the waterfront, brought in actual good catering, and instead of speeches from leadership, we invited employees to nominate colleagues who'd made significant contributions. The stories that came out were remarkable. An inventory clerk who'd redesigned the warehouse layout during his own time, improving efficiency by 20%. A customer service representative who'd personally called 50 at-risk clients to understand their concerns and developed solutions that saved 42 of those accounts. An engineer who'd mentored 3 junior team members, and all 3 had been promoted within the year. I listened to these stories and realized this was what my grandfather had built. Not a corporate empire or a family dynasty, but a place where people who cared about their work could do it well and be recognized for it. My father had lost sight of that, turned the company into a vehicle for his ego. I'd spent months trying to undo that damage, but only now understood that undoing wasn't enough. We had to build something better in its place. As the evening wound down, I stood and asked for everyone's attention. I kept my remarks brief. "This company belongs to the people who make it work every day," I said. "Not to the executives, not to the board, not to the Harper name. You're the reason we survived the past year. You're the reason we'll thrive in the years ahead. My job is to support your work, remove obstacles, and make sure you have what you need to succeed. That's it. That's the whole job description." The applause that followed felt different from the polite clapping at shareholders' meetings or board sessions. It felt earned. After the event, several employees came up to thank me personally. A warehouse worker shook my hand and said his team had been talking about leaving before the leadership change, but now they were invested in seeing where the company could go. An administrative assistant told me she'd never felt like her ideas mattered until recently, and now she was excited to come to work. These weren't dramatic declarations. They were quiet confirmations that culture was shifting, that people felt valued in ways they hadn't before. October brought unexpected news. Preston's criminal trial had concluded. He'd been convicted on 3 counts of fraud and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by probation and restitution payments. Vanessa had taken a plea deal, avoiding prison in exchange for community service and paying back the funds she'd misappropriated. My parents weren't charged criminally but faced significant civil penalties and had been forced to sell the Mercer Island estate to cover debts. I learned all this from a brief news article, not from any family communication. We hadn't spoken since my mother's angry phone call months earlier. I felt nothing reading about Preston's conviction. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just a distant acknowledgement that consequences had finally caught up with choices that had gone unchecked for too long. Grace asked if I was okay. I told her honestly that I was. This was justice playing out the way it should. Preston had stolen from the company and from employees whose livelihoods depended on that money being used properly. He was being held accountable. That didn't bring me joy, but it did bring closure. A few days later I received a letter forwarded from my old apartment, the one I'd lived in during the planning phase. The return address was a federal detention center. Preston's handwriting on the envelope. I almost threw it away unopened. Instead I sat in my office late one evening and read it. The letter was shorter than I expected. He didn't apologize or try to justify what he'd done. Mostly he expressed confusion about how everything had fallen apart so quickly, like he genuinely couldn't understand the connection between his actions and their consequences. Near the end he wrote, "I always thought you were just the quiet one who didn't understand how business worked. Turns out you understood better than any of us. I'm not sure if I should be impressed or angry." He signed it simply, Preston. No brother, no family closing, just his name. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer. Maybe someday I'd feel something reading it. For now it was just another document, evidence of a relationship that had never been what I'd wanted it to be. November was budget planning season. My first time leading the process as CFO rather than just providing analysis that nobody used. I approached it differently than my father had. Instead of top-down allocations where executives decided how money should be distributed, I asked department heads to submit proposals explaining what they needed and why. Sharon requested continued investment in operational technology and training. Our head of product development wanted increased R&D budget to develop next-generation components. HR made a case for enhanced benefits and professional development programs to support retention. I reviewed every proposal carefully, met with each department to understand their reasoning, and built a budget that prioritized strategic growth over executive perks. The board approved it with minimal discussion. One member commented that it was the most thoughtful budget presentation he'd seen in his tenure. I thanked him, but internally I was baffled that something as basic as asking people what they needed and funding accordingly was considered exceptional. It suggested just how dysfunctional the previous leadership had been. We implemented the new budget in December. The immediate impact was tangible. Employees who'd been making do with outdated equipment got upgrades. Training programs launched that helped people develop skills relevant to their career growth. Benefits improved in ways that showed we valued people as humans, not just labor resources. December also brought the company holiday party, traditionally a black tie affair at an expensive hotel where my father would give a self-congratulatory speech and employees would feel obligated to attend. I canceled that format. Instead we rented out a local brewery, made it casual, and explicitly told people they shouldn't feel pressured to come if they had other plans. Turnout was higher than the previous formal events. People brought their families. Conversations felt genuine instead of performative. I spent the evening moving through the crowd, not as the executive demanding attention but just as someone who worked at the same company and was grateful for the community we were building. Near the end of the night Dylan found me standing near the windows overlooking the brewery floor. He handed me a beer and said, "You know, a year ago I was planning to quit. Had another job lined up, better pay, and I was just done with the dysfunction. Then you walked into my office asking for help with access logs and I thought maybe something might actually change." He paused, took a drink. "I'm glad I stayed." I clinked my bottle against his. "I'm glad you did too. Wouldn't have made it without people like you willing to take a risk on something better." He nodded and we stood there in comfortable silence, watching employees laugh and tell stories, looking like people who actually enjoyed working together. The year ended with financial results that exceeded projections. Revenue up 16% from the previous year. Profit margins improved to levels we hadn't seen since my grandfather's era. Client retention at 81% and climbing. Employee satisfaction scores at all-time highs. The board sent a formal letter of commendation thanking me for exceptional leadership during a critical transition period. Industry publications started reaching out for interviews about the turnaround. I agreed to a few, always making sure to credit the team rather than positioning myself as some kind of savior. The truth was I'd just stopped the bleeding. Everyone else had done the actual healing. In early January I finally took a real vacation, my first in years. A week in the San Juan Islands, staying in a small cabin with no Wi-Fi and spotty cell service. I read books that had nothing to do with business. I hiked through forests that smelled like cedar and salt. I sat on the porch in the mornings drinking coffee and watching ferries cross the Sound. For the first time since this whole journey started, I felt like I could breathe without a constant weight pressing on my chest. I thought about my family sometimes, wondered if my father had found peace with losing the company or if he was still bitter. Wondered if my mother had finally stopped blaming me for telling the truth. Wondered if Preston would emerge from prison with any insight into why his choices had consequences or if he'd just feel like a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Mostly though, I didn't think about them. They'd made their choices and I'd made mine. We'd all have to live with the results. When I returned from vacation, there was a message from Patricia asking me to meet for coffee. We sat in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe while she explained that the board had been discussing long-term succession planning. She said they wanted to remove any ambiguity about my role and formally offer me the CEO position, not just CFO. Richard's seat. The one he'd held for 23 years and driven into the ground. I asked why they thought I was ready for that. Patricia smiled slightly. Because you've been doing the job for 6 months already. The title would just make it official. She slid a contract across the table. 5-year term, significant compensation increase, equity stake that would make me a major shareholder. I read through it carefully while she waited patiently. When I looked up, she was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You don't have to decide now, she said. Take a few days to think about it. I set down the contract. I don't need a few days, I told her. If the board believes I can do this, I'm willing to try. But I want it clear that I'm accepting on the condition that we continue prioritizing operational excellence over growth for growth's sake. I'm not interested in building an empire. I'm interested in running a sustainable company that treats people well and delivers quality work. Patricia extended her hand. I wouldn't have offered it to you if I thought you wanted anything else. We shook on it. The official announcement would come at the next board meeting, followed by a press release and internal communication. Until then it stayed confidential. I walked back to my office in the cold January drizzle, collar turned up against the wind, and tried to process what had just happened. CEO of Harper Industries. The position I'd never thought I'd hold, never even imagined wanting, because it had always belonged to my father and seemed so far outside my reach. Now it was mine, not because of family legacy but because I'd proven I could do the work. That distinction mattered more than I could articulate. The announcement happened in late January. The board meeting was brief, just a formal vote that passed unanimously. The press release went out immediately. Within an hour my email was overwhelmed with responses. Congratulations from colleagues, interview requests from media, messages from business school professors asking if I'd speak to their classes about leadership and turnarounds. I responded to what I could and delegated the rest to Grace, who'd been promoted to chief of staff and was far better at managing my calendar and public presence than I'd ever be. The internal announcement went to all employees with a note from Patricia explaining the board's decision and expressing confidence in continued growth under my leadership. The response from employees was overwhelmingly positive. People stopped by my office throughout the day to offer congratulations. Sharon brought champagne she'd been saving for a special occasion. Dylan sent a gif of someone doing a victory dance. Even the skeptics, the ones who doubted me initially, seemed genuinely pleased. I'd proven myself not through speeches or grand gestures but through consistent follow-through on commitments made. That had built trust in ways nothing else could have. The first week as CEO was surprisingly similar to my previous weeks as CFO. Same meetings, same decisions, same challenges. The title change didn't magically alter what needed to be done. But it did clarify my authority to make long-term strategic choices without constantly seeking approval. I used that authority to implement several initiatives I'd been considering. We established a formal mentorship program pairing experienced employees with newer ones, addressing the knowledge gaps created by previous high turnover. We launched an innovation fund that allocated budget specifically for employee-driven improvement projects, giving people resources to test ideas without going through layers of approval. We restructured executive compensation to tie bonuses to company-wide performance metrics rather than individual department results, incentivizing collaboration over internal competition. Each change was small on its own, but together they signaled a fundamental shift in how the company operated. By March we'd completed the full turnaround cycle. From near insolvency to stable profitability, from toxic culture to engaged workforce, from family-run dysfunction to professionally managed enterprise. The transformation hadn't happened overnight and it wasn't finished. There would always be new challenges, market shifts, competitive pressures. But we'd built a foundation that could withstand those pressures. We'd proven that Harper Industries could succeed on merit rather than legacy. That felt like enough. One afternoon in early spring I was working late when Mr. Caldwell stopped by unannounced. He rarely came to the office anymore, having fully retired after the transition, but he still checked in periodically. We talked about the business, about upcoming projects, about nothing in particular. Eventually he stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Your grandfather would have liked you," he said. "You remind me of him." Same stubbornness, same refusal to accept that things can't be better than they are. I thanked him, not sure what else to say. He smiled. "Don't let it make you reckless. Stubbornness is only a virtue when it's tempered with wisdom." After he left I sat in my office as dusk settled over the city, lights coming on across the skyline. I thought about where I'd been a year and a half ago, invisible and overlooked and convinced I'd never matter. I thought about the choice I'd made to document instead of ignore, to act instead of accept. I thought about all the people who'd helped along the way, some of them intentionally and others just by doing their jobs well. I thought about my family, scattered now and dealing with consequences I'd set in motion but hadn't caused. They'd built the house of cards. I'd just been the one who stopped pretending the foundation was solid. The company my grandfather built was still standing, stronger now than it had been in years. That felt like the only legacy that mattered. Not the Harper name, not family dynasty, just honest work creating real value for real people. I shut down my computer, turned off the lights, and headed home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, decisions that needed to be made, problems that needed solving. But tonight I could rest knowing I'd done what I set out to do. I'd saved the company and I'd proven to myself that I belonged in the room where decisions got made. Not because of my last name but in spite of it. That was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.